Hello and welcome to the Your Financial Pharmacist Real Estate Investing Podcast, a show all about empowering pharmacists to achieve financial freedom through real estate investing. I'm Nate Hedrick, and each week, my co-host David Bright and I explore stories from pharmacists all over the country who are achieving their real estate goals while maintaining a meaningful career in pharmacy. Whether you're a first-time investor or a seasoned pro, we're here to provide education and inspiration about the world of real estate. Please note, this podcast is intended for educational purposes only and should not be considered financial or investment advice. Hey, David, how's it going?
Hey, good, thanks. How you doing, man?
Good. We are nearing the end of the year here, where I've been reviewing numbers all week, getting close to the end, making sure everything's been tracking pretty well, and trying to just get ready for the end of the year.
Yeah, and I know we've talked about this before when we've talked about accounting and taxes, and that's not always everybody's favorite thing, but it's a super important thing to do on a regular basis, right? It reminds me that Vince Lombardi quote: "The practice doesn't make perfect; it makes permanent."
Yeah.
If you're just doing what you're doing and you keep doing it, it's not necessarily helping you get better at what you do. If you're not reviewing your investing, trying to figure out what's working, what's not working, you're just going to settle further and further into a groove that may not be the best.
Yeah, it's super true, and something that I think becomes more apparent the more properties you own, right? If you've got one or two, it might not be a huge task, and you can really kind of squeak by without too much of that diligence. When you start to add more properties to your portfolio, it can be a really good habit to get into, to be able to manage those and following that over time.
Yeah, and I think it can be particularly true also when you are self-managing, because there may even be things to look at there. Like I know when my wife and I tried to self-manage for a minute, like we realized that our vacancy time was huge because we didn't have time to get to it. And so even just looking at, even if it's one property, just peeling back and looking at the details of that year and how it went and what were your vacancy times, what were your repairs like, how quickly were you able to get to those things, whether you're self-managing or managing someone else, I think that can be valuable as well. And I'll throw in there too, that if it's a more management intensive property, like if it's a vacation rental or short-term rental, something like that, this could also be a great time of year to look back at that and say, what kind of things need to be different for next summer, if it's more of a vacation rental or those kind of things, what improvements are appropriate, all those.
And this is always that time of year too. I kind of, especially again, we're recording this right at the end of November. This will be live beginning of December. That's like when you have a couple of weeks left before the end of the year. If there's a tax move you need to make, right, this is the time to check in because you've got 2-3 weeks left to do it. So make sure if there's something you need to do, get it in now, right? That's always the time to look at that.
Yeah. I know we've talked about that some in the last couple episodes here about taxes and just making sure that people are planning well. Yes, we are at the end of the year there. So yeah, all of this kind of looking back, planning forward. This is a great time of year for all that. And I know one of the things we were discussing right before we hit record is we were both going through this and kind of comparing notes of like, what's working for you? I don't, what's that kind of stuff. We were realizing that this year had a lot of variability in tenants paying. I think there's still some of the COVID assistance. There's just general variability that happens with tenants, but then also some of just the, on the opposite end of that spectrum, some of the incredible stability that we saw of some of the voucher programs, kind of what's colloquially known as the Section 8 programs, things like that, where there's essentially no variability. There's kind of clockwork payments. So all those differences.
Yeah, I've been feeling that myself recently. I just received a $4,500 catch-up payment from a tenant who got some of that assistance and was able to kind of get back to baseline with after being a little behind in some rental payments. And again, that is difficult, right? If you're not planning for it, to have that non-predictability of no rent. Okay, here's a big chunk of change. What do you do with it, right? So, one of the things that you and I were talking about or noticing is that Section 8 tenants or housing vouchers, right? Section 8 is colloquially known in a lot of places. They're a lot more consistent, right? You can remove that variability. They're paying on time. It's clockwork, right? Especially in seasons like right now when that on-time payment might be seen less frequently. And so it's an interesting tactic.
Yeah, and I know you and I both get questions. It's come up a few times about the Section 8 related programs like that, and whether or not investors should participate in programs like that. And there's certainly a lot of nuance there. So people that are planning for investing adjustments for 2023, we thought this may be a good topic to dive into. We talk frequently about diving into these deep dives every few episodes to hit a topic that we haven't talked about in great depth. And so this is one of them that's come up with different guests and these rent assistance programs. And is Section 8 something you should participate in or not participate in? What are the legal consequences? All those kind of things, and whether it could be a good fit for you on your real estate journey.
Yeah, and I want to take a step back, right? Put my realtor hat on because I have to. And especially as you mentioned, like legal and like, do I want to participate?
Yes.
You really need to know your local ordinances, your local laws. Make sure you are thoroughly investigating and following the rules. This is a huge area where you can really get hurt in real estate, right? We're all about safety oriented and doing this for the right reasons. And so if you're looking at this and you're trying to make these decisions, make sure you understand what decisions can be made. You do not want to break a fair housing law. That is hugely, hugely bad. And so making sure that you're following your local requirements on this. I mean, there are states out there where you can say no voucher tenants, and there are others where you absolutely cannot, right? And these laws are changing regularly. We actually have some legislation in the books right now in Ohio where there are several municipalities who have said you cannot say no vouchers, whereas the neighboring township or the neighboring community says, yeah, you can post that. If it's your rental, you can say we don't accept vouchers, right? So it can vary just that much in a street by street basis. So you absolutely have to get this right and make sure you're looking at your local ordinances and local laws.
Yeah, absolutely need to make sure that as pharmacists, we pay close attention to that. As real estate investors, we need to pay close attention to the law as well. So, all that being said, I think we wanted to break this into 3 key topics to discuss when we talk about these housing assistance or voucher programs. So, one is the mechanics of the program, who pays and how does that all work? Then rent rates for the program. How do those rent rates compare? And then requirements for participation. So what do you need to do as an investor if you want to participate in a program like this?
Perfect. So let's just jump right in. I think the mechanics are a great place to start. Again, I should step back a second and say these can be varied. Again, it matters state by state, municipality by municipality, even by the housing choice voucher program that's running it, right? Like, so locally here, we have the Cleveland Metropolitan Housing Authority. They run our voucher program. And so they're administering that. And so we can link to things like that in the show notes or show you some of the areas where you can access information. But that's where you want to be looking at what is considered Section 8, right? And who's running that for you. We'll probably even refer to this program as Section 8 throughout this, just for the sake of talking about it, but realize it might be something different in your local municipality.
Yeah. And what I'm most familiar with and the way it plays out locally for me, particularly in one of the markets where I invest, is where a tenant pays a portion of the rent and the voucher covers the difference. And that rent assistance comes from that local housing unit. And that voucher component of that is the clockwork component. And then the tenant's portion of that is hopefully still clockwork, but may not be quite as perfect. So that makes the rent collection a little more complicated because it may be coming from 2 sources. But generally, at least the voucher portion of that, which is oftentimes the larger portion, is highly reliable.
Yeah, and that's the part that, again, like you said, when people talk about this is clockwork, it's guaranteed. You'll hear that term thrown around a lot. You're talking about the portion paid by the government or paid by the housing voucher. But it sounds like, again, what you're alluding to is there's still a potential that tenant might not pay their portion, right?
Yeah, so that is a potential that the tenant may not pay their portion of that, and that may have repercussions on their eligibility to maintain in the program. There may even be hiccups that happen where there may be some sort of catch up. I think like you experienced, or things like that may surround a move in, a move out, something like that. But at least for me, that's always been sorted out. So it's still worked out in that regard as far as the voucher component. And there's a lot of incentive for the tenant to keep paying their side of things, because if the tenant loses eligibility for that program, that's a substantial hit, right? So the tenant has a lot of incentive. They're generally going to keep up with their end of the rent payment to make sure that they stay in the program, they maintain the voucher, and can stay in that property.
And it can take months, in some cases years, to get access to that voucher program in certain cities. So losing that eligibility is huge. I mean, it really can be detrimental. And remind me, David, when we're looking at this, right? If the voucher program is looking at an individual and a particular property, they're evaluating that individual's income to determine how much they're paying, right?
Yeah, depending on the program, I know some of them are income based, some of them are situation based, some of them help different people for a number of different reasons and provide some sort of voucher. But yes, I think a lot of the most common voucher programs have some sort of income base to that. Okay, so a minute ago you mentioned a big catch-up payment that you received, and I think that you said that was more related to COVID assistance, right? And how
Correct.
that does tend to come in lump sums right
Yeah.
now, and that can definitely be hard for an investor if they're getting no rent, then several months of rent all at once. That fluctuation can be difficult. So, talk to me a little bit about just the reliability standpoint of that rent and how that stability can be helpful.
Yeah, a good clarification on that situation I mentioned before. That is not a Section 8 tenant. That is not a voucher tenant. This is again through a housing assistance program. It's a little bit different. But for the Section 8, the reliability can be really helpful. You know, a lot of new investors, that fear we have when we start off is, what if the tenant doesn't pay the bill, right? I think we all have that moment we put a new tenant in a property and it's like, okay, well, if they don't actually pay, like, what do I do? Now I've got to come up with all this money. And it's a really good question to ask, like, what do you do? And so that check and that balance, like, you have to have that. And Section 8 can provide that period of stability that you might not otherwise get with a tenant that you're just screening and hoping for the best, right? And again, keep in mind, right, this is something that we've all experienced. Every investor that you talk to that has multiple properties, they will tell you about times where they didn't get payment from somebody. And it's just something that it's going to happen, right? Vacancy exists, someone not paying, that happens. And so this is a decent way to curb some of that and to help with either building up an emergency fund or preparing for the next tenant down the road, whatever that looks like, to make sure that it's always going to be running as smoothly as you can make it.
Yeah, and I would say that having a tenant with a voucher system involved doesn't take away all your risk. Like,
Right.
even a tenant with a voucher doesn't mean that they're going to live in that property for 30 years and never move out. Like you mentioned, there's going to be periods of vacancy. There's going to be periods of then non-payment during the vacancy. And so it can be helpful, though, particularly investors that have a few houses, like say you have 3 houses. If one of those or 2 of those have a voucher tenant in it, that can just, when you're predicting cash flow and things like that, that can help if a little more guaranteed rent, and again, we'll put guaranteed in air quotes, right? If the guaranteed rent is there, that can be helpful just from that cash flow planning standpoint.
We talked a little bit about Section 8. I know we want to stick to that, but I also know we've been kind of alluding to or mentioning these other types of programs, other organizations that might help support rent when it's needed. What does that look like? I mean, again, I've experienced this a little bit. What about yourself?
So my property manager called me one day saying that there's a local organization that they work with, and that local organization supports individuals and families that are trying to get out of a domestic violence, intimate partner violence situation, like some kind of just not good situation.
Yeah.
And they're looking for stable, safe housing. And so my property manager knew that we flip houses in addition to holding rentals. And so they were asking, is there anything that you were going to flip that you might keep as a rental or anything more? Because we're getting all these calls and we really want to help people find a safe place to get to. And so unfortunately at the time we didn't have anything that was, coming up ready where that would be a fit. But that stuck out to me as another opportunity. I know pharmacists, we get into this, wanting to help people. And so sometimes there's that opportunity to help people, to work with an organization, to fit all that together and make this more than just an investment that's dollars and cents on a spreadsheet. But some organizations like this, there's a definite helping people standpoint to that.
I think that's huge. I think there's so many cool stories of times where, you or I or people we've talked to have taken houses that were completely uninhabitable, have fixed them up, and then provided housing to an organization like this. And you can really change somebody's life, right? Just by doing that. Yes, you're creating a good investment for yourself, but you're also creating a really cool opportunity for somebody else out there, which I love that. That to me is like the reason to keep buying houses like that solely, right? I love that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I do want to touch on, though, too, the kind of the downside, right? Or the catch, right? Because it sounds like, oh, this is perfect. Why wouldn't you just pick only voucher tenants all the time? Why does somebody say, no Section 8 or no vouchers accepted at this particular property. Is it related to the rent rates? Like, how do these rent rates compare to the market rent rates?
Yeah, so I think that can be very different in different markets because it's not like there's one rate that every 3-bedroom house everywhere in America is X rent, because we know that that's going to be very different in New York City and Kansas City, right? Like
Yep.
different parts of the country are going to have very different rent. And so in those areas, the rent may be different, and it could be to zip code, it could be to cities, like that could be blocked out in different ways. But in some locations, the voucher may come in at or higher or lower than the market rent would typically be. That just varies quite a bit. And so that there may be then again some local nuance to why that could be advantageous, or it could be a disincentive, but why that could fluctuate so much.
Gotcha. I know we see the same thing here in Cleveland, where what they'll do is they'll actually set up by zip code. And you can go onto the CMHA website, and by zip code, you can see for a 3-bedroom house in this zip code, here's the rent rate that we'll pay. And you can march down every single zip code and see what that looks like. And what happens sometimes is areas that are really popular, that like every investor is buying in or every family wants to live in, the rent rates increase much faster than the housing authority actually increases the base rent rate. And so you'll see a house listed for $2,000 a month that the voucher rate is only $1,450, right? It's not even close.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to appeal that, and it can be a big process. And so what often people will do is they'll say, look, I'm not accepting vouchers because you're not going to be able to pay anywhere near what the market is going to be able to pay. And again, legal or not, depending on where you're at, that's the reasoning behind at least what I've seen in some communities around here about why that voucher program maybe not be preferred.
Yeah, and I've seen similar things where, when you look at one of those tables, say that the 3-bedroom rate is $1,450, the 4-bedroom rate might be $1,850.
Mm-hmm.
And so in some houses, if there's a basement where you can put an egress window and you could build a legal additional 4th bedroom in the basement, or maybe there's a large room upstairs somewhere that you could cut into 2 rooms. Like I've seen investors come in and try to make a 2-bedroom house into a 4 or a 3 into a 5, something like that. And in certain areas, market rate or voucher, that can drastically increase the rent, where rent is often tied to bedroom count.
Yeah. And one of the tricks to watch for there, though, is that, especially like with the voucher program that I'm familiar with, they'll come and do an inspection, right? You can't just throw 4 more beds in the basement and call it,
Yep.
More bedrooms, right? They're going to do an inspection. They're going to make sure that it's a comfortable, safe space for people to live in before just jacking up the amount of money they're sending every week.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Don't go putting a cot in the corner of the basement and calling it a bedroom. Right.
Does not
Yeah.
count.
All of the legal things, all the permits, all the everything must be appropriate for all that to count. Absolutely. So yeah, a lot in there that I think we just can't emphasize enough. The fair housing rules, the do not discriminate, a lot of the legal aspects that work into that. And like, let's just mention that several times so that that's not forgotten. When we're talking about the mechanics and the participation in a program like this, if an investor wants to participate, because you just mentioned inspections a second ago, like what are some of the requirements? What are some of the things that you have to do in order to participate in a program like this?
Yeah. So one of the best things you can do if you're considering this or you're about to put a rental on the market and you want to learn more about it is reach out to your local housing authority, figure out who it is, and just ask them like, hey, what does this process look like for a tenant, right? One of the best things you can do is understand that process inside and out so that you can help those tenants through that process if you're working through that, right? So if someone comes to you and says, hey, I'm on a voucher program, do you accept that? Because that's every time I post a listing, that's like the first 35 questions I get is, do you accept Section 8 vouchers? And again, you should be able to say, yeah, absolutely. And here's how to work through the process. You look at the property. We're going to evaluate you just like we would any other tenant. Then we'll have the inspection process, or again, whatever your local municipality is going to do. The typical time frame, though, is that it's going to take a little bit longer than a non-Section 8 tenant. So you'll, again, have the process where they'll apply. You'll have to coordinate with the Section 8 housing authority. They'll do their inspection. They'll give you a rate for that property. Like I said before, they're going to say it's 4 bedrooms, but hey, that third one doesn't really count. So this is actually 3 bedrooms, and here's the rate that we would pay you for this. And then if that all checks out and everything looks good, then you basically accept the tenant like you would any other tenant. And then you'll start accepting payments right away. So it's pretty easy, but the best way to make sure that you're doing it right and to make sure that you're not missing anything is to call ahead of time, way before you list the property, and just have the housing authority walk you through the process for your specific location so you can understand it inside and out.
Yeah, and my experience too has been that if you call, sometimes they'll even give you a list of what are the frequently missed things on an inspection too,
Yeah.
or what are some of those definitions? Like you mentioned, the one bedroom might not count, and so they may be able to provide you resources. Like in order for it to count as a legal bedroom, it needs to be 70 square feet, have 2 electrical outlets, have a HVAC vent, or have a window, and have a closet, and like whatever all those requirements would be. They may be able to just provide that up front to make it really clear. And then you can use that as a self checklist too, to make sure that your property meets all of the qualifications. A lot of that too comes back to safety when they talk about you need this many smoke detectors in these places, you need a carbon monoxide detector, you need this, this, and this. And so you can use that as a way to reinforce the safety of your unit too. So my experience with those second inspections is that, that second set of eyes is sometimes really helpful just to make sure that all those safety boxes are checked.
I agree. I've not seen them be overly nitpicky. One of the things that I run into here a lot in Cleveland is bad landlords will post properties. They'll get a Section 8 voucher tenant and they'll be halfway through the process. Section 8 will come in, do an inspection, and say, here are 45 violations you need to correct. And they're all like basic safety and health stuff that they need to correct. And then the landlord will say, never mind, you can't live here. And they'll basically deny their application because they don't want to do the work to like actually get their property to a nice livable standard. And it's a really unfortunate problem. And again, one that, we can kind of step in and help to correct if it makes sense. But it's just those, like you said, that second set of eyes is there to be helpful. It's not there to penalize you. It's to make sure that people have a safe and healthy place to live.
Yeah. So let's go with the assumption that pharmacists are going to invest in properties that are safe and would meet those rental inspections, and so they're gonna pass that. Now it's time to market for rent. So as someone that manages their own properties and works with voucher programs like this, is there anything from a fair housing or marketing standpoint that you want to pay attention to so that you don't get 35 questions in the first hour of how this all works?
So from a fair housing perspective, again, you need to look at what your local laws and municipality is requiring. Some areas of the country, it's okay to say no vouchers accepted here. Some areas it's not. Federally, it's not income is not a protected class, right? So where your income comes from is not federally protected. And so you need to follow your local jurisdiction. If you want to take what a lot of local municipalities have done and extrapolate it out and say, look, if X city down the road thinks that should be a protected class, then I'm going to operate that same way and just open it up to just about everybody. But make sure you're posting that right on your listing, right? You can say Section 8 housing vouchers accepted. In fact, a lot of times if you use rental manager tools like Zillow or apartments.com or Stessa does this, all of the major platforms for posting your own listings, if you're going to be doing that, they'll have a section on there that says accepting housing vouchers, and you click yes or no because it puts it right in the listing so people can see that pretty upfront. So again, make sure you are allowed to turn that on or off if that's a decision that you're making before you do that. And then again, follow what your local laws require in terms of how you're allowed to disclose that and what decisions you're allowed to make up front.
Yeah, and I would say too that this is not necessarily something just to go on, Zillow or one of these and look at what other people are doing and just copy that, because there's all kinds of people that do this wrong all day long, right?
100%. I have seen so many incorrect ones. It really is appalling. And honestly, what's even worse is some people will post it the right way, and then on the back end, they'll deny people. So they'll say, yeah, housing vouchers accepted. They'll get applicants and they'll get them through the process and they'll deny them outright. This goes back to the other episode we had, months and months ago. I'll have to find the episode number, but we were talking about looking at accepting a tenant and actually reviewing the process of an application. Put your criteria down on paper in advance so you don't ever have to worry about a fair housing violation, right? I'm looking for somebody with X, Y, and Z criteria. Once I get the first person that meets those criteria, I'm going to offer them the place. If they don't accept it, then I'm going to go to number 2 down the list, right? Set up those in advance and you'll protect yourself from any sort of problems.
Absolutely. Yeah. And some of these are just very fundamental across the board. Pay attention to the laws, because while there can be differences in different geographies and different voucher programs and different requirements and inspections, hopefully a lot of these just kind of general considerations can help to clarify those next steps and actions needed should you choose to participate in a program, a voucher supported tenant situation.
And if a lot of this sounds overwhelming, right, there are great resources out there for you as well. You can call your local housing authority. You can call a reputable local property manager to walk you through this. Most of what we're talking about is if you are self-managing this, right? If your property manager's in charge, they're going to handle all this for you anyway. But if you're looking at self-managing, or you want to make sure you understand the laws around that, this is the kind of the baseline to start with, and then you can grow from there and start learning from people local on the ground.
Absolutely.
Well, hopefully that gives you guys a good insight into Fair Housing Program vouchers. And if you've got questions, specifics you want us to answer, stories you want to tell, whatever, reach out to us on the YFP Real Estate Investing Facebook group, or head on over to yfprealestate.com. You can connect with David and myself. We'd love to hear from you guys. So hopefully you enjoyed. Have a great rest of your week.
Thanks for listening to the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast. If you like what you heard on today's show, please leave us a review and subscribe to the show so you never miss an episode. If you have a question, know someone that would make a good guest, or want to connect with Nate or David, head on over to yfprealestate.com and join the growing YFP Real Estate Investing Facebook group. As we conclude this week's episode of the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast, an important reminder that the content in this podcast is provided to you for your informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding materials should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on this podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of your financial pharmacist, unless otherwise noted, and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you for your support of the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast. Have a great rest of your week.